Hey everybody. Okay, so this might be a long video. I don't know. We'll see. It's a topic I've been wanting to talk about, and I've been sort of trying to collect my thoughts of what I wanted to say for a while. So there's a lot of them, but we'll see. Um, but the general topic is, can you use all this MBTI typology, sociotics, all that stuff for personal growth, self-help, um whatever you want to call it. And um and my thoughts on it are, I think it's complicated. And I think it's a little bit of yes, a little bit of no, but not in the way that I think most people out there in the quote unquote community sort of push it as a vehicle for self-help or growth. And a lot of it is because the personality types, cognitive functions, all that stuff, of course, stem from Jung, who's a psychoanalyst, and that was his whole thing, was trying to um, help people in their personal growth or overcome whatever complexes or issues they were having, right? And and like I've said before, the whole personality types thing was sort of like a field guide for other psychoanalysts, where if you had a patient and they were an extroverted thinker, then they want to watch out for the introverted feeling stuff as sort of this boogeyman that's going to creep in to their unconscious and sort of pull the strings from behind, from backstage, right? And guide somebody's behavior in sort of this unknowing, uncontrollable way, right? And the whole system, or the whole Jungian approach, was, he thought of consciousness very differently than I think of it, which I'll get into in a second. But his whole approach was like, you've got the stuff that you're aware of that is going on in your conscious mind, and then you have all this other stuff, all these other players in the background, that are sort of backstage, and they're not in the theater of your mind, but they're sort of pulling the strings and making things happen that you're not really aware of, right? And the way to sort of individualization or self-actualization or whatever you want to call it is to develop your unconscious, or sort of become aware of it as best as possible, right? And whether that's through psycho analysis or dreams or whatever. And so that you have some level of either control or awareness of what's going on, right? So if you're a TE user, and you have this FI boogeyman that's sort of pulling the strings in the background, that you could sort of become aware of, the fact that you're so engaged with your TE and building your little empires that you're sort of forgetting what's meaningful to you, like your family or something like that. And so, to really achieve individualization is to sort of, develop these underdeveloped functions in some respects, right? And of course, that sort of line of thinking, or that approach, is sort of the DNA, I think, of a lot of the typology community, in that we have these shadow functions, again, that are sort of creeping in the background and tugging at our at our behavior, and we're not really consciously aware of it, but it's just kind of going on in the background, and it's what's leading to whatever psychological complexes or issues that we're having. And the best thing to do is to quote unquote develop it, right? So if you're an ESTJ and your lead function is TE, then you want to develop, your third and fourth function in some respects, to become sort of a more of a well-rounded whole person, right? Okay, so I think I'm kind of stating the obvious, but I just wanted to point out that I think that's sort of the territory where most of the sort of self-help stuff comes from, the personality, personal growth stuff. Um, I see it as very different. And a lot of it is tied to the way that I think of consciousness and the cognitive functions is very different than what Jung, how he thought of it. Um, and so understanding the difference there might help. Um, so let me start with that, and then I'm going to make a couple of other points, and then, maybe get to the grand finale of what I think that the typology personality types really can do to help somebody. Okay. So again, Jung, his whole theory of consciousness was sort of like, what's that Pixar movie or maybe Disney movie, Inside Out or something, where I think it was called Inside Out, where there's these different characters that represented different sort of, stages of the mind, like emotions, like, anger and jealousy and fear, things like that. But they were represented by these little characters, right? And I sort of think of Jung's version of consciousness and unconscious is sort of like that. Not exactly, but sort of like that, where you have these different functions. You have, extroverted thinking or introverted feeling, and they're sort of little characters playing their roles in your mind, right? So to speak. And you got 4 of them, maybe 2 to 4 or so. I see there's some comments. I'll get back to them towards the end here. I just want to stay on track here with what I'm pointing out. Okay, anyways. So you have these sort of characters running around in your unconscious, and maybe 2 of them you're aware of, and maybe another 2 you're kind of aware of, right? So those would be your first 4 functions. And then you have all these other functions sort of backstage that are, again, sort of pulling the strings and making things happen, but you're not aware of them. They're just sort of running amok on their own, these little goblins, right, in your mind that, you can't really control because they're in your unconscious and you don't have sort of direct access or direct control over them. And so they sort of pop up in weird, mysterious ways and sort of guide your behavior in ways that could be unhealthy, right? If they remain unchecked or get too heavy. Okay. So the point being that you could engage in behavior through things that you don't control. Okay. So to put it more concretely, so if you're a ESTJ and you're lead TE, then any function on your back stack, so like TI, is quote unquote unconscious, right? So your unconscious can be engaging in some sort of TI type activity without you knowing it or being in control of it, right? And when I say it out loud, it stops making sense, at least to me, right? Because as I think we all know, we all use all 8 of the cognitive functions, right? And if an ESTJ is engaging in a TI process, it's not unconscious, right? He is engaging in it in a very conscious, deliberative, focused way, right? It's in his attentional spotlight, so to speak, of consciousness. Just because it's on his backstack doesn't mean it's quote unquote unconscious. And that is that gets to sort of the difference between what Jung was talking about and what most psychologists today think of consciousness as being, is, sort of what your attentional spotlight is focused on in your mind or in your brain, right? And so it's not so much as these little characters, but these different computational processes. And if you're engaging in a TE task, then you have parts of your brain that does TE computation. And that part of the brain becomes more active. And actually, a lot of what it's doing is filtering out the other parts of the brain and suppressing them. And so that part of the brain, gets more blood, gets more energy, and And then, people like Dan Dennett and other cognitive psychologists or philosophers, whatever, would say that is what consciousness is the fact that you are selecting different modules in your brain to do processing. And when it starts processing and suppressing everything else, there's sort of this epiphenomenal effect of, okay, boom, all of a sudden I'm having this qualitative feel of, planning out this TE task, right? Focusing on it and thinking about each of the steps. Or I'm engaging in something FE and I'm thinking about how, okay, if I say this, then this person I'm engaging with is going to say that. And if they say that, then I'll say this, and so on and so forth. And because you are processing it, it is quote unquote making noise in your mind, right? And that's consciousness. Sort of think of it as, an orchestra where, if somebody's playing an instrument, all they're doing is, moving a bow on a string, but the sound comes out, right? This total different phenomenon is produced, right? And so in the same way, your brain's doing this computational stuff and trying to run algorithms or whatever it's doing, right? Neurons are firing. And then just epiphenomenally, this conscious awareness of what you're doing comes out, right? And there's a debate about whether or not you need things to be unconscious to sort of control it. We'll leave that aside for a second. But it's very different than Jung's take on it. Jung was more like you got some stuff going on that you're in control of and you're aware of, and then a bunch of other stuff that's running in the background. And my point is that you can't have things running in the background without them becoming conscious, right? So if you've got quote unquote TI running in the background or running in the unconscious, that doesn't make any sense. From a Dan Dennett, what they call, multiple maps theory of consciousness, where once you start engaging in TI, it becomes conscious, like, sort of by definition, it becomes conscious, right? And so the whole idea of unconscious cognitive functions has never made sense to me because I don't think of consciousness in the way that Jung did, right? Again, he had much more of sort of a theater way of looking at it, okay? Now, one quick aside, there are things that do become automated behaviors, right? So, the first couple of times you drive from your house to work, you have to consciously think, okay, I need to get on this exit, on this highway and take this exit and then turn right here and then turn left here. And then after you do it 5 or 6 or however many times, it just becomes automatic and you don't have to think about it every time, right? So I understand that things do start automating themselves and you don't need to spend as much consciousness on repeated procedural type tasks. So I get that. But what I'm saying is when you're engaging in these the 8 cognitive functions, when you're presented with a new problem that hasn't become an automated behavior, it's going to, by definition, become conscious when you do it, right? So when you're an ESTJ and you're engaging in TI, even though it's in your backstack, it is conscious, right? Once you start engaging in it, right? You don't have TI or FE or SE or something, running amok in the background and sort of pulling strings without you sort of being aware of it or being in control of it, okay? So that leads me to sort of a difference in the way that I think all of this typology stuff can be used for quote unquote self-help, right? Because I don't think it's a matter of developing your shadow functions or anything like that, because I think whatever your type is, it is wired in your brain that way. I'm going to argue. Now, whether or not it's nature or nurture, it happens very early in development. And if you're an ESTJ, your brain is just wired so that TE stuff is just sort of running automatically, right? It doesn't take a whole lot of brain resource, blood, energy, all that kind of stuff to do TE stuff, right? You could sit there and do it all day, right? If you're an ESTJ, and you're not going to break a sweat. If you're an INFJ, you're going to be sweating, anytime you got to do the TE because you're polar in it, right? Okay. And so your brain is just wired that way. And does it make sense to say, okay, I'm an ESTJ and I want to start developing my fourth FI, introverted feeling function? Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you're going to go out and start engaging in a bunch of FI materials so that it somehow becomes easier? Like it's sort of like you're working out and you're just developing that muscle the more you use it. They do say, if you, use parts of your brain or, engage in cognitive tasks and stuff, your brain will get better at it over time. But is it really ever going to rise to the level of your first two functions, right? Your extroverted thinking and your introverted sensing, right? Does it make sense to even, to push yourself and try to build those little brain muscles so that you're evening up your FI with your TE? And I think we in the West, I can't speak for all cultures, but at least in the West, we have this fixation with things being symmetrical, things being balanced and equal, right? And I think there's this idea that if you have heavy TE and weak FI, that is somehow a weakness in you because we expect things to be balanced. And it goes back to Plato, it goes back to the Greeks, and you saw it in the Enlightenment. And, most Western philosophy is obsessed with things being in balance and making rational sense, right? Like, having things in perfect ratios. And I would argue that's not how nature works, right? I mean, just look at the golden ratio, look at the Fibonacci sequence, look at, E and I and all the irregular numbers or irrational numbers and pi. Irrationality shows up in nature and there's a reason for it, right? Because when things grow in sort of the golden ratio spiral, they cover more area, right? So if so think of leaves growing on a stem, on a plant that, like a weed or something, and the leaves are growing. If it followed a rational formula, all of the leaves would be growing out in a very symmetrical, fixed pattern. And if that happened, then the raindrops are going to hit the top leaf and all the leaves below it, right? If it's in a straight line, aren't going to get any water, right? And so plants and shells and shells are kind of the same way. They want to protect the entire area. And if it followed a rational formula or algorithm, you would have little holes in the shell. And it's the fact that it's following an irrational algorithm is what makes it, the shell and anything that grows that way, cover the entire space. Okay. So you could look this up on YouTube. You'll get like a visual representation of it. But my point is that nature, by and large, is not rational. It does not follow rational algorithmic formulas. It follows things in somewhat irrational ways because it wants to cover as much territory as possible, right? And so you have these different types. So if nature was completely rational and it followed a fixed formula, we would all come out as basically either, one type or maybe two types, right? And then that leaves us open to the stuff that we're not covering, right? So if we were all ISFJs and we all, excuse me, and nature had this algorithm for producing INFJs or ISFJs, let's use ISFJs as the example, then we're all ISFJs, and now we become susceptible to anything where we needed, things that ISFJs are bad at, right? Um, and so nature fills those holes by having different types, right, that play different roles in your culture and protect your culture, right? You need all the types. You don't need, maybe, as many ENTJs as you need ISFJs, but you still need some ENTJs because they plug holes and they play a certain role, okay? And so there's this sort of beauty of nature, right? And its irrationality because it's figured out how to sort of protect the culture by coming up with these different types, or to protect whatever's inside the shell by following a very irrational algorithm when it's building the shell, or to get as much water into a plant by following an irrational formula so that the leaves are sparsed out, right? Um, so, does it make sense to try to round all your edges, right? Or, to try to become this whole self actualized, individualized, whatever you want to say, person by developing the weaker functions? I don't think so. I think there's two things to get out of, or really one main thing to get out of the personality type. And it goes to something that I'm sure we're all familiar with, and it's the Serenity Prayer, right? Give me, what is it here? I pulled it up here. We all know it, right? Give me 1 second. I just don't want to get it wrong. Okay, give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference, right? So I need calmness to accept the things that I can't change, but I also need some courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So when it comes to this personality stuff, I think, you have to sort of accept what you've got, right? And you need to be, serene or accept what you don't got. Now you could say, but do I have the courage to change it, right? And I would say, does it really need to be changed? If you get the serenity to accept it. And I also think there is sort of this wisdom of knowing, like, okay, if you're an INFJ and you're TE polar, you're just TE polar, right? And that's what the personality typology stuff does for people, is it gives them the wisdom to know the difference, right? And once you know the difference, you could be, start accepting, what you're good at and what you're not good at. And it's cool. It's fine. Everybody's got a strength, everybody's got a weakness, right? But this obsession with just trying to have everything in balance, I think does way more harm than good. And and seeing, your type as a vehicle to help with self growth, yeah, if it's giving you the wisdom to know the difference of the things you can change and the things you can't change, but it becomes this sort of endless loop if you keep trying. If you're an INFJ and you keep trying to work on your TE, like, this year I'm going to become a carpenter, right? Or this year I'm going to, I don't know, engage in a bunch of TE stuff, and frankly, I can't imagine a more, waste of your time, right? It's just not the way your brain is wired, right? and it's nature's design to fill all these different roles within the culture. Okay, and so I think people would be much better off if they sort of focused on, well, what do I do well? What do I enjoy doing? You typically enjoy doing things that you do well. And that's the whole, in the 70s, there was in the 70s, 80s, there was this whole movement, focusing on flow, right? Csikszentmihalyi, I can never pronounce his name, but he wrote the book Flow and did all the research on flow, where when you engage in an activity that is challenging enough to, keep your attention, but not so challenging that you want to give up on it and get frustrated. So you're not too bored and you're not too frustrated. You're right, in the sweet spot. People will have this sense of flow where they just sort of lose sense of time and they're just so focused on the task at hand. And not only that, but they report, this what they call subjective well-being, right? Like, they report being happy, they report being content. And so I would definitely recommend looking into his stuff. Read his book Flow. It's very easy to read. And he goes into detail about how different types of people engage in different types of behavior. Now, he's not getting into MBTI and typology, at least not that I remember. But he does point out that different people like to do different things, and it gets them into this sense of flow. And so using your type and sort of knowing what your quote unquote superpowers or strengths are might help you figure out, okay, this is the kind of stuff that I like to do, right? This is the kind of stuff that puts me into my flow state, given, I'm an FE user. And so I'm lead FE. I can do FE all day. And so I'm going to try to find things to engage in, FE wise. Or I'm an SE Dom, and so I'm going to do a bunch of SE stuff, right? And your overall subjective well-being will go way up, right? There's another good book called The Pursuit of Happiness. Who wrote this book? I looked it up here. David Myers. It's from the 90s. And again, he sort of makes a similar point, and he's saying, look, happiness, self-actualization, subjective well-being, whatever you want to call it, is not just this window of opportunity that's going to show up, and you have this, one window in time, and once you get through it, then you're always going to be happy, right? They make the point that it really is about process, right? Just making sure you're engaging in processes that give you this sense of flow, that give you this sense of serenity, as much as possible, right? And if you can find a job that allows you to do that, even better. And avoiding things that are either too challenging or too boring for you. Those are the people who are the most frustrated, right? And you have to think about it both ways, because people who have really boring jobs where they're just sort of doing the same thing over and over again and not really using their mind in any active way, they're just as frustrated as the people who, where things are, too challenging to, like if I had to become a carpenter, like if they forced me to be a carpenter, that would just be way too challenging. I'd be frustrated all the time, right? So you want to find that sweet spot. And so again, instead of focusing on, how do I improve this function that's way down on my stack, and I'm going to, start going to parties, and, working on my FE when I'm an INTP, it's just going to be so frustrating, right? Work on it a little, but really, I think it's just, you get older, these functions start developing a little bit more. If you get a job where you're an INFJ and you have to do a lot of TI stuff, your TI will get better. It gets better over time. But to me, it's not like something you need to focus on or something you need, like lifting weights or something. And especially stuff, like your polar function. I mean, again, I think it just does way more harm than good because you're just going to be frustrated all the time. Okay, so that's my rant on the self-help stuff and what this typology stuff may or may not be able to do to help people. But I'd be interested in your thoughts, and feel free to leave a comment. Okay, I got some comments here. Let's see here. I believe typology can be used. I'm going to read the comments and react if I can, the best I can. I believe typology can be used as a self-help vehicle, but only if you're capable of self-analysis. Typing with Eric showed the many examples of people going awry with helping themselves. Yeah, I agree. So I do think it helps to have, somebody like Eric who knows what he's doing, who could give you an objective read. And I do agree that like 90% of the problem is just people not really knowing their type or getting uncomfortable, and the shoe just doesn't quite fit, so then it sort of becomes a question of like, what do I focus on if I'm, trying to find the state of flow. So I agree, that's definitely a big part of the problem. But I think, going to somebody who knows what they're doing and getting, a relatively accurate assessment and, maybe, testing it out with a few other people would definitely help. But I realize that, a lot of people just are in this endless loop of trying to figure out which type they are. And I think maybe it was Michael Pierce. Michael Pierce, he was pretty active years ago. I don't know if he's still active, but he used to make a lot of videos that I watched. And one of his videos, I remember him saying, just pick a type and go with it, because chances are you're probably right. And I kind of like that advice to some extent, as long as you're going with it on a reasonable basis. Okay. Inside Out is the movie. Okay. With the emotion avatars. Okay. Thanks. I consider unconscious and is untrained in regards to the seventh function. I blame the psychobabble terms not making inherent sense. Okay, so again, just to sort of reiterate my point, is that any function you are using, when you are using it, it is going to be conscious. And I understand that in Jungian terms and a lot of other models, they see backstack as being quote unquote unconscious, but really, I don't think of it as unconscious. I think of it as just a lot harder to bring into consciousness, and it requires more attentional resources than your first couple functions. But once you bring it up, it's in consciousness. It's just how hard is it to keep that spotlight on there, or maybe another way of thinking of it is how bright is the spotlight? Is it dim and kind of flickering, kind of static on the system? Where it's conscious, you're using it, but it's just kind of, little staticky, a little dim, right? I think it's a better way of thinking about it as opposed to saying it's quote unquote unconscious. Because again, Jung was talking about what can you control and what are you aware of and things like that. And I just don't see it that way. But I totally get it, that what I'm saying is different than what he said. Okay. You're so educated. Nature is definitely not rational. Thank you. Appreciate it. Spent way too much time in school. Trees don't absorb water through their leaves. They absorb it through their roots. Yeah, okay, I get it. Yeah, I misspoke. But the point is that the leaves sort of bring in the water and bring it into the plant. And that is a source of, bringing water into, basically the area of the plant, right? Like catching the raindrops and they fall down into the ground and go to the roots. I get that. Okay. Must be a professor in lab. Yeah, I taught in grad school. My dad was a professor too, so it's sort of in the genes, I think. Um, I think typo, and I do teach classes now, but not this stuff. It's a totally different area. Um, Understanding limits. I was interested to learn communication skills with my stubborn family members. Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's I like that point too, and not something I mentioned, but I think it's a good point. This commenter is saying it's useful in understanding limits, and I think he's talking about limits in other people because he mentions other family members and their communication styles, and I do think that's also a benefit. Is actually I think it's one of the main benefits. So I'm glad you brought it up because um, I always tell people, I did fairly well in school and in law school, but a lot of it was to be because I knew how to read the professors, right? I knew what the professors are going to want on their tests. Like, in case you don't know, in law school in America, especially your first year, you get one test at the end of the year for each class, right? So you take contracts, you don't get any tests or anything until the end of the year. You have one test, and whatever grade you get on that test is your grade for the class. And so I ended up doing, pretty well, not because I was a whole lot smarter than everybody, but because I knew how to read the professors. I just, and again, I wasn't into the typology stuff and all that as much at that point, but it's just when you're an INFJ, you're just sort of automatically doing it. And you're just like, oh yeah, that professor's going to want this, and that professor's going to want that, and blah blah blah. Excuse me. And so you use your quote unquote INFJ superpowers, um, and so you do learn how to read people. And then when you really get to know the typology stuff, and you really know, okay, I'm dealing with an ESTJ here, or I'm dealing with somebody who's a TE, heavy TE user, I need to explain myself in a TE way, right? Or I need to explain what I'm doing in a TE way so that it registers with this person. And I can't be going on my big NI rants, right? If I'm talking to an ESTJ, they don't want to hear my NI stuff. They want to hear, how I'm going to solve whatever problem they've got. Okay. Thank you. I wanted to clarify that since it does make a difference in the rationality. Yeah, no, I get that. The whole leaves, are they collecting the water? Whatever. But I do think it's an interesting way of looking at nature, right? Like, nature, it needs these irrational patterns to cover as much ground. Um, with shells and leaves growing off of trees and stuff like that, because if it followed a rational pattern, then things would start breaking down. Like there'd be too many holes sort of popping up in the system. Okay, I'm going to stop this video, and then I might start another one on a different topic. I guess I'm kind of in a YouTube-y kind of mood today. So thanks for stopping by. I'll be back in a second with something else to talk about. And all of you who are looking, at this stuff, for self-help and whatnot, focus on the positives. Have the serenity to accept what you can't change, the courage to change what you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. There's no better way of explaining or thinking about self-help and self-actualization than that. So good luck. Talk to you soon. Bye.